Hello. All right, so I want to talk about where do you start when you're thinking about integrating. So I'm going to share my screen. And of course, I'm starting right now with a benchmark lesson because that's what I have access to. But the same concepts can be applied to reading roots. And I know you cycle through stories much more quickly, but I know that with some grade levels already, and I think first grade is the one that's done this, they created that games unit based on one of the stories in their cycles. And I think that's a good way to look at it. So when I look at benchmark, one of the first things that we did it with the fifth grade team was we looked at the overall themes that are in benchmark. Let me just remind you of those guys, which are, oops, sorry, right here. So these themes right here are in every single benchmark book, whether it's a second grade one or even a seventh or eighth grade one. So we all have that in common in that, like, the first unit is focused on some aspect of government and citizenship. And of course, what it talks about, like in the younger grades, it's talking about, what makes a community. For example, they'll talk about, well, you have libraries and you have parks and all that sort of thing. Whereas when you get to fifth grade, we're talking about like how laws are changed and how the people have a voice in making those changes. So you have that wide range, but it's a commonality that the whole school has, and it's a great opportunity for us to introduce the leadership themes. So that being said, let's say I'm just going to take second grade, for example. Second grade, unit 1. And this is how I was kind of looking at it. So what I started with was, when I looked at unit 1, obviously we know that the theme is having to do with government, and it's government at work. So when you look at, this is the student text, which, obviously you could be looking at the teacher's text, but just for the sake of clarity, within the student text, what I start with is that essential question that they're being asked to think about during this unit. Why do we need government? And so as we talk about why do we need government, we can begin to think of an authentic experience that students can go through while reading these stories that allows them to express their leadership, allows them to express their artistic or even engineering plans. So for example, I noticed when I was looking at this second grade reader, they talk about parks, they talk about the battle flag, but they talk about like different roles within the community, right? So that there's this long story on smoke jumpers. And then again, Betsy Ross again, they're really into her, even though that's like, I don't want to talk about the historical accuracy issue that's going on here, and the flag, right? So obviously, I think a simple project, if you wanted to focus on that aspect of it, is for them to think of design a flag that represents either themselves, but I think actually what would be more powerful is if they could come together as a community and design a flag that incorporates some symbols to represent themselves as a class. This is our class flag. And so it would incorporate a lot of our leadership qualities, our leadership habits, right? So they would have to figure out a way to think win-win as they talk about, together corporately as a group, what they want for that flag, what symbols, sorry, pardon me. So true integration is when, and I think we've talked about this before, when the cognitive demand for their ability to read these stories and their cognitive demand to create a project are at about the same level, right? So that's what differentiates this sort of an activity from enhancement. So if they were to just draw a picture of a flag or learn a flag of the world, that would just be an art enhancement activity for them. But if we're actually asking them to come together as a community during this time and think about what they would want to have represent themselves on this flag, that would be asking them to do something as arduous as reading some of these pieces in this text. So that's that's one way I could think specifically with this unit in second grade of creating something. And the beauty of doing that is that once you've done that, as they're looking at all of these stories, as you read them, because you're doing these things simultaneously, you're not going to separately the last week create a flag all along as you're reading. Like when you're reading this piece on government making laws and talking about safety, you can say, okay, is safety a value that's really important to us? Should we put a symbol on our flag that shows that that's something that's important to us? And what it does, hopefully, and you could come up with a totally different project for the same unit, which I'll talk about in just a second. But what it does is it gives purpose to everything they're reading, which is real reading, right? I don't, at home, I don't read a book unless I'm interested in the topic, right? In my real life. When we read for real, we read because we want to understand something, or we want to learn something, or we just enjoy something. And so that's something that's really difficult to replicate in school, especially with texts like these. So if you can create a project that is like a hook that makes this meaningful, then you'll find, and I'm talking from personal experience, having taught Benchmark without integration and with integration, that this will become a powerful reading experience. So when I first taught Unit 1 in 5th grade to my 5th graders on government, it was a slog. It was hard. The text is difficult. They read part of the Constitution, which is a beautiful document, well written, but I'm a sophisticated reader. And to ask my emerging reading 5th graders to take that on was just, and it didn't hold any connection to them. The next year after I'd gone to an arts integration training, and they had to come up with this living history museum based on these pieces, all of a sudden I would see them going back to the piece and looking, okay, well, what does it say? And it wasn't that I had a highly academic group. I had a group that was struggling academically, but because they knew that they needed that information for their performance, that they began to really dig in and fight their way through the reading. And they would ask those clarifying questions that they hadn't asked before. So that's sort of the lens. So you're not creating something new. You're bringing something to the surface, or you're viewing what you've always done with a different lens to give it power, is one way to think about it. So at first glance, and obviously the second grade teachers have taught this and I haven't, but just that concept of, because they mentioned Betsy Ross multiple times and they mentioned the flag, creating a flag that represents your class would be a great activity that would both integrate art and leadership skills. It's a twofer with this unit, right? And you could tie together all of these concepts, like all of these, like this here, December 1776, we're defining ourselves as a nation. They're defining themselves as a classroom. It's that sort of bringing it all together that will empower them, theoretically. Now, I look at these same pieces of reading, and you could come up with something totally different, right? So, for example, in the beginning, it talks about various jobs. So you could have them do a project where in a group, they are researching jobs and created a poster for it, right? You know, you could do something like that. You could also have them talk about, the other thing I thought about with second grade is, because this is all about obviously government and jobs and who does what and all that kind of thing. You could actually do some sort of, and I think I looked at third grade curriculum as well. You could create some sort of class election, create a position that is necessary for your class. And instead of having everybody take turns, everybody has to apply for the job. And then they have to talk about what qualities you would want. So, and you could take them through the whole process of defining what the job is, defining what qualities are necessary for the job, talking about how you're going to make the choices, the concept of possibly voting for the person to get the job based on meeting these qualifications that you define together as a class. So all of that to say that the purpose of looking at these pieces with an integrated eye means, often for me, it's a good place to start, coming up with a performative piece, whether it's a presentation or like in one of our units, they had to participate in a debate. So we had a debate tournament. where they had to compete for points and move on in the tournament. Or before that, they had to choose. When we look at the piece this year for Unit 1 in 5th grade, we couldn't do our Living History Museum because that was something you had to be physically present for, had to have your audience come in. So we had to twist it for COVID. And so instead of doing that piece, instead we looked at it the same group of reading that we'd read. And we talked about the fact that all the people mentioned in Unit 1 are white men. And why is it that some people are left out of the story when we talk about history? And so they had to prepare a presentation for a woman of color to be added to textbooks. So we gave them names of people that we wanted them to research. I think we had 12 people, and they were all women of color. Some were African American, some were Latinx, some were from the Philippines. And we asked for them to put together a presentation stating their case why this person should be added. So again, it was just like with this 2nd grade piece right here. It was the same group of stories, but we looked for something for them to do that would give meaning to what they were reading. And that would be my hope for you, whether it's Roots, Reading Roots, or Benchmark, is to empower students to see the purpose of reading the text.